Welcome, everyone. We are so pleased to kick off this season of Sculpture Milwaukee Talks with the internationally known artist Mary Miss in conversation with Sculpture Milwaukee artist Maggie Sasso. This conversation is being moderated by Emilia Layden, the curator of collections and exhibitions at the Haggerty Museum of Art at Marquette University. Emilia joined the Haggerty staff in 2012 with a specialization in contemporary art after earning her MA from the University of Chicago and her BA from Boston College. New York-based artist Mary Miss is an internationally known artist who has been redefining how art is integrated into the public realm since the early 1970s. She is interested in the boundaries between sculpture, architecture, landscape design, and installation, all within a vision of the public sphere. She has developed the City as Living Lab, a framework for making issues of sustainability tangible through the arts. Collaboration has been central to her work, as she has developed projects as diverse as creating a temporary memorial around the perimeter of Ground Zero, marking the predicted flood level of Boulder, Colorado, and revealing the history of the Union Square subway station in New York City. From 1998 to 2001, Mary Miss worked in Milwaukee on designing the Riverwalk project. She has been back in Milwaukee over the past few years, working on a large-scale project called Watermarks, which involves creating an atlas of water pathways in the city of Milwaukee. Maggie Sasso, whose work is featured in this year's Sculpture Milwaukee, is a Milwaukee-based textile artist who produces conceptual bodies of work that examine the role of material culture in relationship to our collective past. Her installations are tactile and penetrable, presenting objects as theatrical props and material relics, inviting us to explore the past while also considering our collective future. Maggie has exhibited locally and nationally, and in 2015, she was the recipient of a Mary L. Noel Fund Fellowship for Individual Artists. Welcome, everyone, and thank you.
Thank you, Deb, and thank you to the Sculpture Milwaukee staff for facilitating this program. I'm delighted to be here today and to reconnect with both of these artists who I've had the pleasure of working with before. And I'm so glad we're able to feature your work as part of this program. You will both be discussing specific projects during the conversation. Deb referenced those. And the point of connection between those projects is your interest in water. Specifically, you have a shared interest in the ways that Lake Michigan has shaped Milwaukee and its people over the course of history. So before we begin our Q&A, I want to acknowledge that the Haggerty Museum of Art and many Sculpture Milwaukee installations are on the traditional homelands of the Menominee, Potawatomi, and Ho-Chunk Indian nations, who have known this land and these waters as a relative for millennia and who remain our hosts on it. Before we delve into the specific relationships between your projects, we're going to run through a series of images so that our audience can learn more about the projects. And just a reminder to everybody who is participating, please feel free to post questions in the chat or in the Q&A. We will be addressing those at the end of our conversation. So Mary, we will go ahead and start with you.
Thanks, Emilia. It's really a pleasure to be in Milwaukee, at least virtually. I've been coming about once a month for the past maybe 5 or 6 years. Initially, I was invited to come to do a project about water. I had done the historic Third Ward Riverwalk, sometime before, and a group of citizens invited me to come, and my task, a very simple one, was whether I could do an urban scale project about water. And this involved multiple visits, especially in the first year, coming out and looking and trying to understand how and where to start. I chose the Inner Harbor as the start point because all of the rivers come together there. This was an initial drawing that I did after deciding that's where I wanted to start this focus. So this was a really important beginning for me. one of the things that was really as something I was thinking about was how to do an urban scale project. I knew it was important that you couldn't just have a single location to talk about a topic. Something as important as the resource of water has to be a very widespread conversation. So how to do that with rather modest means? So I was looking at all of the stacks and church steeples in Milwaukee. And again, thinking about how to do something on a large scale. And I started thinking about atlases and how they would call out different aspects of a place, of a map or of a photograph with a key at the side. And I thought, what if I could do a full-scale mapping of issues of water in Milwaukee? I decided not only did I want to start at the Inner Harbor because the three rivers are coming together, but also the Jones Island water treatment plant is there. So you see in the distance of the top image, the stack of the plant. And I've been really interested in how you could repurpose infrastructure. So after spending considerable time trying to imagine what we could do, we decided to go with the idea of the stack as a central beacon for the project, that it would be lit with blue light of the vapor and of the surface, and it's a moving light. It's as though you're seeing light reflected through water on the side of a boat or a wall. And if there's the chance of a sewage overflow because all of the storage facilities are full and the plant can't treat any more of the water, the stack would turn red and the vapor would turn red. And so we wanted to send out a call to people in the community, in the city, citywide, to take action, not use so much water, not take a bath that night, not use their dishwasher, and to be part of the green infrastructure, so to speak, of the city by storing water longer. But in each of the neighborhoods, there's going to be a marker, this kind of stake in the ground where a conversation about water can happen. And the letter atop each of these markers pulses in the different neighborhoods when there's going to be that overflow, so that the call and response that we're trying to set up can happen across the city. So this was the first marker that went in. It's at the Acosta Middle School. There is another one that's about to go in by Pulaski Park at 16th Street, next to the KK River that's being restored. 3 additional markers are going to be going in along Greenfield, leading you to the harbor. And then we've started working in other neighborhoods. But let me just say simply that I wanted to come in as the artist providing a concept, a conceptual framework for the project. And what I'm asking is that many other artists in the city then come and do projects, one at least at each of these sites. So along the KK River, there are already projects in place that you can see if you go look east on 16th Street. There is a project across the street under the highway here at the Acosta Middle School. But I really wanted to get the idea that a constellation of artists could help spread this idea of helping to protect our water and this vital resource.
Thank you, Mary. That's great. Maggie, we'll turn it over to you to run through your images.
Mary, it was really great to hear you talk about that work. And thank you everybody for having me. My work is also about water, but in a slightly more personal way. Many of my pieces tell a story or come from a moment in my personal life. This is a rescue device. When my husband and I first moved to Milwaukee, my husband was working for a company and he's an engineer, but he was running boats into logs as part of his job. And I was enamored with Lake Michigan and sort of found it meditative, but was also finding it a little bit fearful because my husband was taking such risk on this body of water. And I was also starting to research the material culture of maritime history and came across this hilarious and ridiculous device to rescue people that did not last long. They only tried it out a few times before they determined that it really wasn't terribly effective. So I recreated it in this sort of theatrical language. I took the piece onto a sailboat and did a photo shoot of myself sort of utilizing the device and all of the ridiculousness involved in such an endeavor. So it's a little bit humorous and a little bit uncanny at the same time. I learned how to weave and was really interested in how textiles started to become these labor-intensive objects. And I started to think about the role that textiles plays in maritime culture. So this is my first weaving project, and it's a 14-foot tall sail. It does not actually function, but it's a sculpture of such a sail. And I'm a relatively new mother, and at the time I made this piece, I was a very new mother, and I was thinking about the labor involved of motherhood and the fragility, but the strength that is required to go on these journeys, both physically in water and also metaphorically in our lives. And then I took 3 images of the sail going for a little swim in Lake Michigan. This one's called Ashore. So we tossed the sail in and it kind of made a journey back to shore. And this was at full of sand in Lake Michigan, waves crashing. And I really love the interaction between the textiles and the intensity of nature, and taking this precious handmade object and more or less ruining it, certainly not considering it a precious object, and how that enriches the experience of the object and kind of propels it outside of the confines of a gallery space. Another piece that went along with the sail were these handmade Semaphore flags. And the model is my mother, who is on the call. Hi, Mom. And she is signaling out into an empty Lake Michigan. And for me, this piece is very much about loneliness and tragedy, and that experience that we get with motherhood where you're both trying to hold on and let go simultaneously. And then, not chronologically, but the last we'll talk about in this brief artist statement is, or artist talk, is the Lighthouse, which is currently installed at Northwestern Mutual as a part of Sculpture Milwaukee. What a great honor. It was really wonderful to be able to work at such a large scale, which I was only able to do because I got the Knoll Fellowship and got funds to do so. So the first image you saw was the piece installed at the Haggerty, and Emilia and I worked together to get that puppy in there. And then the next slide is it in right outside right now. And I was really driven by scale with this piece. The scale of the actual lighthouse that we see at the breakwater here in Milwaukee. From a distance, it looks so far away. It looks so miniature, cute even. And then when you can approach it by boat, it becomes this sort of ominous, scary, isolated place. It's only accessible by boat. In fact, you have to pull up, and there's not even a dock. You have to leap off of the boat and grab onto a rusty ladder to get into the structure, which is something I'm not brave enough to do, I don't believe. And, you know, from a distance, the water looks calm and delightful, but as you're in it and you're at this breakwater, there's waves crashing, and it becomes a kind of scary place, and it's hard to imagine spending time there. So I did some research along with my friend Laura Miney, who's a hobbyist historian. And we dug through lots of old newspaper articles and discovered lots of really interesting stories. One of the articles that we found was about a scarlet tanager that got flown off course and landed at the lighthouse, and several of the lighthouse keepers nursed it back to health and sent it on its way. And it was just so great. This was 1938, so there was an article written about it at that point in time. And another article in which they talk about lighthouse keepers who got marooned. Usually they only stayed 2 or 3 days there, but they got stuck there for 10 days and there's no running water or electricity. So, you know, it's so interesting that it's so close and yet so far away from civilization. And especially at a time like we're living in right now, we're physically living so close to each other, but we're also very siloed and individual. So there you have it.
Thanks, Maggie.
Yeah.
You both touched on scale in your talks, and that's something that I really think is a strong point of connection between your work, in that you think so actively about that. And Maggie, this is really the first time you've worked outside. Yours is much more of a kind of solitary, studio-based process, and Mary, of course, you have always worked in that way. So I think it presents certain challenges and certain opportunities, and I think you touched on a few of those, Maggie, in terms of the way that Too Much Sea for Amateurs-Marooned has been activated in its particular siting in front of the Northwestern Mutual building. And you have a great video that we're gonna watch that I think illuminates that. But before we get to that, I'd love to hear you talk, Maggie, a little bit about your process of creating this work, which, as you mentioned, was enabled by the Knoll Fellowship. You fabricated this initially on your own sewing machine at your house, and that just makes my head hurt. So I would love to hear about that process, and I think our listeners would as well. And then I'd also love to hear you address any modifications you had to make to make the work suitable for display outside, where you obviously are dealing with the elements in a particular way that you aren't in the gallery space.
Yeah, thank you. The process of making the lighthouse initially was daunting. It kept me up several nights. I would wake up and just wonder how I was going to get this thing made. The interior is a metal structure, and the exterior is all fabric. So the first thing I did, it's a relatively faithful replication of the Milwaukee Breakwater Lighthouse, and it's a 1/5 scale replica. So I looked at the original blueprints of the lighthouse and scaled it down. So I started with dimensions and then went out on a boat and took photographs all around the lighthouse to discover what the windows looked like. And then I just started sketching what the different panels needed to be in sourcing materials. And I knew that it was going to be exhibited inside, but I kind of had in my mind this idea that it could exist outside because I was interested in the way that the wind would interact with the piece. One of the articles that we discovered talked about how the 12-foot thick concrete walls were shaking like fabric during one of the really intense storms in an October day in the 1930s. And that got me thinking a lot about fabric in nature, and then the impact of wind on a piece of sculpture. So I found some outdoor quality fabric as opposed to something that would purely be meant to be inside, not knowing what the future would be for the piece. As it turns out, it was a great choice because it allowed me to be in Sculpture Milwaukee. And I just, figured out the dimensions and stylized the windows and got to work. And there's a lot of, if you go and look at it, You know, it looks great from a distance, but as you get close, there's so many little stitch details that are quite rewarding as you approach it. So everything's hand stitched together, not hand stitched, but on a sewing machine stitched together. And it was, you know, it was difficult to do because it was such large pieces of fabric. And then when Marilu approached me about exhibiting it outdoors, my first reaction was absolute excitement. And then my second reaction was, oh my goodness, how is that going to work? So we worked with several engineers provided by Sculpture Milwaukee to determine how strong the interior structure would need to be to stand up to high winds. And they decided that 100 miles per hour would be the marker. So we really had to beef up the interior of the structure from 3/8 inch conduit pipe to 1 3/8 inch, and weld an interior structure that would get bolted to the ground. In Haggerty, we installed it straight ahead and then decided it should be at an angle. So we just two of us went inside and picked it up and moved it. You could not do that with the piece in its current state.
Right.
And then I also needed to go in and prepare it for wind impacts. So we needed venting. So I cut out holes halfway around all of the windows. I had to beef up the ends of the fabric so that they would have grommets and just a lot of reinforcement. So it was labor intensive, but it was really satisfying. And it was nice to kind of fully refine the piece because it felt a bit rushed when I originally made it for the Haggerty.
Yeah, and I think that our viewers will see the ways that installing this outdoors has actually, I think, gotten to the kind of conceptual core of what you were trying to accomplish in really interesting ways, both in terms of, I think, recreating an almost visceral connection to what it would have felt like to be marooned in this lighthouse out in the middle of Lake Michigan, but also injecting some humor. You know, I mentioned to you that I saw this sculpture with my kids, and to them it's like this giant, you know, playhouse they wanted in. So I think it's a good time to watch the video, and then maybe we can talk a little bit about that. So I think that really helps demonstrate, you know, the importance of citing work in public space. And kudos to the Sculpture Milwaukee team for choosing that particular spot, because the way that the fabric is juxtaposed against the kind of steel and glass of the Northwestern Mutual building, I think is really terrific. You know, I think that, you know, Mary, you talked about the importance of citing your work and the kinds of considerations that go into that practice as well. And, you know, it really gets me thinking about how, even though Maggie, your practice is one that has been more kind of solo based, for this project, you really relied on a lot of collaborators and on research to inform the work. And Mary, your practice is a social one, really relies heavily on communities and connections with individuals to drive the work and give it its life force. So I would love to hear, maybe Mary, you can talk a little bit about the role of collaboration in your work, the role of research, and what form research takes in your work. And how you feel that is essential to kind of making work that exists in public space?
The first thing that I would say is to explain that I'm coming to Milwaukee and doing this project as part of a framework that has evolved over the past 10 years. I have a nonprofit called City is Living Laboratory, and the idea is to help governments, cultural institutions, NGOs, scientists to understand that artists could have an important role in addressing issues of creating resilience in our communities, whether we're talking about issues of social equity or climate change. How can artists be recognized as having an essential role that's complementary to the educator or the scientist or the planner and policymaker? So that was very much in mind coming into the project. The nature of this work is collaborative, that I'm working with a group of people in the studio to make something like this happen. We do projects in New York City, as well as this, long-term project we have going on in Milwaukee. We organize walks across the country. We've got this toolkit for how people can organize walks to address issues in their own neighborhoods. There's a City is Living Lab site that you can go to and learn more about these things. But in coming to Milwaukee, it was always going to be about collaboration. Now, collaboration is kind of a difficult word that people talk about a lot, and it's kind of tricky. I think of one of the most important parts of my work being the collaborations that I've had with scientists over the past 10 or 15 years. I've always reached out to others in my decades-long practice. But in this past period since the mid-aughts, I've especially had a lot of conversations with scientists helping me to become more grounded in the issues that we have to deal with. Now, that isn't that the scientists and I are sitting at a table collaborating to do a specific project. It's more that this exchange, this dialogue, ongoing dialogue with a number of people has been a process where there is mutual respect on both sides, where we're both learning from each other. And I'd say that gets translated as I move into a bigger city, a project like the Milwaukee project, which is at the scale of a city. So we are learning things about neighborhoods that we go to work in, about people that we're working with at institutions, the city government, and it's something, I like to say that my practice is the slow cooking version of making art. This is not something where you just come in and it happens quickly. I do want to say that this is a bit of a shift to do this kind of work for me, because I've always been really very focused on the immediate engagement that a person can have. That's how I was trying to get people interested in whatever the topic was. So a slot in the water in Des Moines, Iowa, where you could get in and sit down and look out at eye level with the water, for instance. But here, it's a conceptual work in a way. I'm doing the framing, and I want the artists who are my collaborators in a way to be the ones who are creating the engagement. So if you go to the KK Riverside, you're going to see these really amazing images of river gods and goddesses along the river that Gabby Riveros has done. And then there are bat houses and bird houses by the artist Molly Oblinger. Just across from the Acosta School marker, Melanie Ahrens has done these murals on the columns supporting the highway. So that idea of that kind of collaboration is really important. then there's another level of this engagement of artists that we hope to be able to develop as we move forward. That is mentoring younger artists in the neighborhoods that we're working in to help continue to activate these sites. Are there young musicians, poets, painters, you know, who can be brought in to help keep the focus? Because each one of these markers is not much in itself. It's just a stake in the ground. It's like a giant map pin, and it's meant to be the start of an ongoing conversation. So the collaborations that we have are not always smooth. Emilia could attest to that. They're complicated, but they're really important, and we learn new things all the time. But Emilia, there are more things on the list than collaboration, which I've focused on. Yeah. Would you like to take me back?
I think you did a great job covering my complex question. And I really do think that framing your work in terms, both of your work, in terms of a kind of conceptual practice that does invite this direct engagement with individuals. Mary, you talk about it in terms of a call and response framework. Maggie, you know, and the ways that you want that to kind of elicit stories and personal narratives from people. And Maggie, you've talked about your work as a catalyst for people to simultaneously explore, this is your quote, the past and consider our collective future. So your work takes very different forms, right? But it does seem to have this shared purpose in terms of connecting with people around their stories and these personal narratives. And I'm just hoping maybe, you know, Maggie, if you want to address elements of the last question, but maybe since we're approaching our time here, I'd love to hear you both talk about those kind of shared intentions for the work, if you see them in that way, in terms of connecting to narrative and stories about our collective past, present, and future.
Yeah, you know, I think that for me, making work is so much a way to process things that happen to us in our personal lives and collectively. And you know, history repeats itself is a common phrase that we hear, but I think there's truth to it. And by looking at the past, we can really draw parallels between ourselves and the people before us and learn from how they overcame difficult situations within themselves or as a community. And I tend to focus right now more on the personal, and perhaps it's because the scale that I'm working at. Mary, I can see in your work, you know, you're very successfully engaging larger stories, larger communities. And I find that really exciting and interesting. But I connect a lot with trying to teach people how art can transform communities and individuals. I've seen in my own self how, like, a tragedy in my life can be processed and hauntingly become beautiful through self-exploration and self-expression. And in a community like ours that has experienced a lot of trauma, that seems like an important step for our younger people, especially. Is that the sort of collaboration you're looking to do in the communities with that sort of reaching out to younger generations, Mary?
I think, you know, this idea of narrative is, I think, super important. I think it's the only way we're going to deal with all these complex issues, creating new narratives. Okay, I'm starting a narrative on a very large scale, but the point is to get down to the immediate stories in the communities we're working in. So we work with Michael Tim, a journalist and writer who works with Reflow, and he goes in and in our workshops, he'll identify people who are willing to talk with him And he does recordings of with them talking about their experiences or whatever is of interest to them. And what we imagine is that as you go to each of these sites, as we're trying to create this network throughout the city, you'll arrive at that site and can hear the personal reflections of the people in that community. Mm. So I think, you know, I feel like culture has the ability to create change of all kinds more effectively than almost anything else. You know, culture is the realm of the imagination, the realm of the storyteller. And that's why I feel so strongly about artists being more fully recognized as really important players in this end game that we seem to be putting ourselves into. You know, we can do it at that very, very personal, very immediate level. We can tell bigger stories. So I think it's really an important issue.
Thanks to both of you. I have plenty more questions, but I do want to make sure that we open it up to our audience. And I think I've seen a few come in. So Deb or Mary Lou, if you, I can scroll down and take a look at those. But if you have some that you've got that you want to pose to Mary and Maggie, I'd invite you to do that now.
Hi, this is a particularly interesting one. The question is for both Maggie and Mary. Have you been able to observe visitors interacting with your outdoor pieces? And what have you noticed in terms of the interactions or reactions?
I can start. So my piece is fabric, and I would maybe, if I were going to show in such a public space again, not choose fabric. There have been lots of people very interested. Emilia, you talked about taking your kids there and they immediately thought of it as a playhouse and they wanted to get inside. And we have seen some rips and tears from people climbing on it and looking inside. I just keep imagining, I think this has happened a couple of times, maybe a toddler looks inside a window and then falls down and rips it. It's pretty easy to repair, but it's been, and I'm really in love with a patina and, you know, surfaces that show a history, the narrative of the object that exists. So that's been, you know, interesting. I'm not sure how long the fabric's going to last outside. But that's been the main interaction I've seen. I'm sorry, I'm right next to a wood shop. You can probably hear a power tool. And then people are just interested. I mean, some people come up and take about 2 seconds and then move on, but a lot of times people are sort of like asking questions, and then when I identify myself as an artist, they're really curious and want to hear a lot more, and tell me about their own experiences with the Lighthouse. So it's been great to see that happen.
That's terrific. Mary,
Well,
I know you've seen people interacting with your work.
I think the place that I've been able to watch it most is a project I did in the 80s, the South Cove along the Hudson River. And it's been so interesting to see it age over time. But I think what it means to people has changed over time. And, you know, in the beginning, it was, oh, what is this? You know, I meant it as a place that you could get down close to it's on the Hudson River in Lower Manhattan, adjacent to the World Trade Center. And so it's seen some very different uses. At one point, the Dalai Lama did a Kalachakra ceremony here in New York City that I attended. And then at the end, there was this giant sand mandala, and he and his acolytes took this sand to the South Cove and poured it into the river, because this is traditionally what is done with these sand pieces. For the Kalachakra anyway, they're put into flowing water. But then you jump to images that are always amazing. As I go around the corner, there is a whole group celebrating a Chinese wedding. And it's a really popular spot to bring the whole wedding party to have photographs taken. And then I jumped to the time after 9/11 when I went down there and found tiny pieces of paper all over that had come from the World Trade Center falling down, the buildings falling down, and the railings were all broken open because that's how they got people out of Lower Manhattan. It was one exit route, bringing boats in and evacuating people. And then I kind of skip again to the time that we have now, where people aren't able to meet freely or socialize, but a very frequent thing that a friend of mine has found, since I'm not in the city right now, is that this is a favorite place for people to be able to have a glass of wine with 6 feet between them. So it's, I think, really important as a relief place in the city right now. So it's been interesting to watch a place over time.
Right. And when you work in public space, you can't always control the way that the work is received or utilized, or how people are engaging with it. So there's a kind of letting go that has to happen, I think, with artists. But you both, I think, design your work to intentionally be able to adapt to these different sets of responses. And it does make me think about the, something that we've talked about before is the ways that, considering a kind of constellation of influences or a kind of dispersed network as a way to make work and think about work is really rooted, I think, in feminist thought and feminist practices. And I think you both identify that way. And I'd love to hear you talk about how that's influenced your work.
Yeah, I was raised in a feminist household, thank goodness. And so it's a topic that's always been near and dear to my heart. And I've sort of been enamored with this hyper masculine history of maritime culture. And it's something that I've had to contend with. But by simply placing a female figure or a more traditionally feminine textile practice into that aesthetic, it shifts things just enough to call that history into question. And I'm able to use imagery in such a way that the female figure has to be thought about. And then the stories that I'm telling, about motherhood. I did a piece last year about the Jane Collective. That was a group of women who provided underground abortions in Chicago. And I juxtaposed that with the Oddfellows aesthetic. It was for a specific show where I was asked to respond to an Oddfellows object. But again, that retelling of a narrative through a feminine lens has been an interesting way for me to explore those feminist ideas that are so important to me.
Mary?
I was so lucky to come of age as a young artist and be surrounded by feisty young women who wanted a different narrative out there. The 70s were a pretty amazing time. And we were, jumping over fences, crossing boundaries, trying to imagine different ways of doing things and different stories to tell. And it's absolutely made me who I am today, and the work what it is, where it's not about a singular voice. It's, you know, it's about trying to bring in many voices. It's, you know, not trying to have things only at the crossroads, but across the city. It's a totally different way of thinking about things. And I don't know, I hope we're not too late in telling these stories. I'm so sad these days about what's happening, and to imagine, you're talking about the Oddfellows and the Jane group. What if women didn't have the right to choose anymore? We have such frightening things that we're facing, and I just, in terms of social equity, in terms of the voices of women, people of color, there are just so many important stories to get out there, and we need to tell them faster and louder, I guess.
I think I don't know, Deb, if there are any other questions popping up in the chat. I've kind of been trying to keep an eye on that as well. So please feel free to chime in. But if there aren't, I would just pose another question to Mary and Maggie about what they have coming up next.
I'll start again. I've been making masks, of course, the traditional textiles response to mask making. But all kidding aside, well, it's not a joke, but I'm excited. I think I'm going to be doing a photo shoot at the Lighthouse very soon. That will be kind of a response to the Semaphore images that I showed, where my mother is the figure, but this time I will be the figure. So that'll be an interesting day for casual passerbys, perhaps. I like to think of my work as props for bigger stories, and that's another way that I think about scale. So I have to seize this opportunity to continue to use the objects as props, especially in such spectacular spaces in the city. And then I'll be working on a series of weavings. I've been really thinking a lot about surveying rods and other objects. This weaving right here is based off of a surveyor's rod. So I'll probably explore that imagery and history a little bit more. And right at the beginning of the year, I got a new studio, which is where I'm sitting right now. And I have a 5-year-old daughter, so I only got to use it for a few weeks before she got sent home, and I don't have as much time to spend in here right now. But now things are starting to feel a little bit more normal in pandemic, and I'm like getting up my stamina to stay up later at night. So I'll be coming in here a lot more and starting to process all of the trauma that we're experiencing as a community and culture. And politically, there's a lot to think about with the passing of RBG. And yeah, we'll see what else the future holds, but that's kind of the plan right now.
Thank you. And Mary, I know you haven't been able to be back in Milwaukee to carry on with the ongoing work of Watermarks and the many programs and opportunities that are attached to that, but you've been active from afar. So we'd love to hear updates on what's going on with that, and then anything else that you want to share.
I mean, who knew what we could do with Zoom a few months ago? None of us, I think. And one of the things we've been in the process of doing is forming some groups of people coming from this kind of collection of organizations and individuals that we had been working with. We've formed 3 groups to look at how to activate this project over time, to look at the content that is going to be delivered in an ongoing way and at each site, and thinking about the activation of the project. And we have these groups really working hard to figure out next steps. I know, Emilia, you'll be remembering that when I was first starting out with the project, people were saying, well, how do you do this? And how are you going to keep these sites alive? And how are you going to, it's like, I didn't have the answers to all of those questions. And it's not for me to come up with all those answers. So we're really in the process of working to make this a project of the city and not for the city, because that's the only way that it will be sustainable. The thing that we've learned with the work is that it takes time for people to be able to change behavior, take action, think about things differently. It takes a personal connection, which art can, really does a good job of offering. But we've got to figure out how to make this project sustainable over time. And then the thing that I'm doing every day in my studio is spending at least 4 hours every morning writing a book about City as Living Lab and this decade of work that we've done. And, we're a small organization, and it's very tenuous right now about how this organization will survive, or many other arts organizations. So we want to make sure there's a good story to tell here, and that it can, what we've learned can be helpful. I mean, we've been really lucky, and I think we actually might be able to, keep this boat afloat, so to speak. But I think it's important to reflect on this first decade and what's been possible.
That's really exciting, Mary, that's upcoming. We actually do have a question, a specific question that maybe we'll have you guys answer and then kind of close out our program. But the question is, Maggie, you suggested a few books for Sculpture Milwaukee's reading group, a nod to how a lot of us will be spending the fall and winter. Would you mind mentioning those 3 books? And then the specific question for Mary is, Mary, how many stack markers do you hope to install in Milwaukee?
Mary, why don't you answer your question while
I'll get started while you're looking for your list. Yeah. There isn't a set number. This is meant to be an incremental process that goes on. We'd love to do one for Sculpture Milwaukee sometime, have something downtown. We're working in the 30th Street corridor. We're interested in working along the Beer Line Trail. We're really looking for, we're not just looking, we're devising a process for how this can be offered to people in many different neighborhoods who are going to be interested in it. We're working closely with MMSD, and they've committed to putting markers up with their capital projects in the future and to maintaining the markers over their lifetime. So there isn't a set number. We were trying to get a cluster downtown in the Inner Harbor so that people would have seen a number of these and have some idea of what they're about. One of the big things we have to do is get the stack lit. But we thought first we needed to get some of the markers out. But without the motherships, you haven't got quite such a good call and response situation going. But hey, the sky's the limit.
Maggie, do you have the reading list?
I pulled it up. I just needed to jog the old memory there. The first was The True Confessions of Charlotte Doyle, which is a kid's book. It's young adult fiction. And my friend sent it to me as a birthday present, and I devoured it. It's a delightful book. It's a very quick read. And the author did a lot of research on how accurate it was to be a sailor during the time, which was like 1800s, mid 1800s, as I recall. So he'd read the journals of lots of sailors, and so there's a lot of description about how boats work. And then it's a young woman who, a 13-year-old girl who ends up by herself on a boat, and her journey is feminist, and it's really engaging and delightful. And then also Manhattan Beach, which was on the bestseller list several years ago. And it's also about a feminist story about maritime culture. It's the first female diver for the Navy during World War II in Manhattan. And the descriptions of her wearing those incredibly heavy metal diving suits are incredibly vivid. And then there's a little bit of a mobster theme that's, you know, exciting. But it was really those descriptions of the maritime emerging, the scary emerging of maritime culture. And then last but not least, the Women's Great Lakes Reader, which is a book full of stories of how women have impacted Lake Michigan through all sorts of ways. There were lighthouse keepers, there were women who, I'm drawing a blank. It's been a while since I read that one, but it's a great read. And it's a bunch of short stories, so you just read, you know, you can read a bit at a time. So those were the three.
That's great. Thank you so much. I think we are at time, so I'll just close out our program with additional thanks to Guardian Fine Arts for their sponsorship of the Sculpture Talks program. And of course, thank you to Deb for putting this together, and to the Sculpture Milwaukee team for organizing and facilitating the program. And of course, to Mary and Maggie for making their work, for sharing that work with us, and for making the time to discuss it today. So thank you very much.